I'm here with Tim Cool. Love that last name. You're the Chief Solutions Officer at your company, Cool Solutions Group, and so it's an honor to be interviewing you. You help with facilities of churches all across the country, and yeah, this is awesome. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you.
So today we're talking about the future of the church. And being in the facilities space, I'm sure you have a few thoughts when it comes to building orientation of the future church buildings. But I guess talk to us in general, whether it's buildings or people or whatnot. When you hear that phrase, future of the church, what comes to your mind?
With a bent towards facilities, I immediately think, how are we going to use facilities to impact our communities? And I think we're seeing a major trend the last 5, 10, 15 years when we've seen multi-site expand, church planting expand, and so on, that it's no longer about the building. I've been in church my entire life. My dad was a pastor, and so I've been suckled at the altar of church. But as I start looking at it, we've talked about, it's not church is not the building, church is the people, and we've said that for years and years and years. I think we're finally grasping the awareness that we're really talking about a tool, not a building. And so what we're trying to help churches with is think through, who are you, why do you do what you do, and then what's the right tool to help you fulfill your need? Because the right tool may not be a building. The right tool might be a playground.
Sure.
The right tool might be give all your money to Uganda to help them drill wells. It might be a shopping center. When Jim Tomberlin and I first started working on our last book, we looked at all the different ways churches can be doing church in non-traditional ways. And I think that's, when I think of the future of the church, I think of how do we create more opportunity to be in our communities with facilities than just be this isolated island that then everyone has to come to us. How can we go out into the community?
You and I were speaking briefly about Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, and I love using that analogy with guys who have a lot of experience like you. What has been that determining factor from good to great for the churches you've worked with?
The churches that I've worked with that have taken themselves from being just the country club church to now being the church of the community. That's the first mindset, is it's no longer about us and member benefits. It's what can we do to be contextual in our community. I think the idea of contextualization is the driving factor that changes the mindset of churches. I think that the term contemporary and traditional are made-up words that the church has used to be divisive against each other. I think the real issue here is, are you contextual to the market you're trying to reach? Every church has a target market. Whether they know it or not, they have one. I can walk into a church, I can walk into this church, and they've got a pipe organ. If they start off with a Bach fugue, they have a target market.
Yes.
If I go to my church and we start off with Led Zeppelin, we have a different target market. So you have one whether or not you've identified it or not. The question is your building, your ministries, and everything else that you're doing congruent with the target you're trying to reach? So the contextualization and the congruency is more important than whether you're traditional or contemporary in music style. Those two words really only define meism. Those are personal preference type things instead of being contextual to the market you're trying to reach.
Here in Charlotte, there seems to be a church on every corner, and in this Bible Belt, Bible Buckle, it seems to be the MO, right? And you would think that churches then are competing with one another. You seem to see it differently, as we were talking earlier. What's your take on competition with a local church?
Yeah. In the city limits of Charlotte, there's 800 churches. In our metropolitan statistical area, there's 1,650 churches. So you're right, there's a church on every corner here, and sometimes two on every corner. Most people, if they are not kingdom-minded, they think the competition is First Baptist down the street that just built a gymnasium, and so all their kids are rushing down there to go.
Sure.
Or, hey, they've got this new cool preacher over here with spiky hair, and so that's our competition. They're stealing those people from us. I believe that the church's greatest competition, when we take off our church hat and put on our I'm not a believer, I don't go to church, I don't want to go to church hat.
Yes.
Our biggest competition is, why should I get out of bed on Sunday morning to come to church? Why would I want to sacrifice those extra 2 or 3 hours of sleep that I could get because I work really hard 6 days of the week? I want to make it up on Sunday. The second biggest competitor is all the other things I could be doing if I do get up on Sunday. I can go to Starbucks and hang out with the guys. I can go on a bike ride. I don't know how it is in other parts of the country, but we're even seeing here that the school system is allowing sports to practice on Sunday now.
Wow.
When I grew up a long time ago, Sunday was sacred even in the school systems.
Yeah.
But now they're allowing school teams to practice on Sunday because there's such a glut of teams and a scarcity of fields and gyms and so on. So if those are our first two, I think the third biggest competitor for the church is every other consumeristic experience that person's had that week. We have to remember, they're consumers until they are committed followers of Christ. And so while we talk about, well, we don't want consumers at our church, we only want dedicated Christians. Well, until they're a dedicated Christian, they're a consumer.
Yeah.
So get over it. If I go, my wife and I are blessed with triplets. And when they were small, and we would go to the local grocery store, that's kind of the nicer chain in this area, when you've got 5-year-old kids, besides the candy aisle and the cookie aisle, you always go to the restroom when you're out in public. And with 3 kids, it was 3 trips, because you get to the milk aisle and you got to come back, and you get to the meat and so on.
Awesome.
That food chain here had the nicest restrooms. They had tiled floors, tiled walls, paper products were always full. So as John and Susie consumer with our kids, and we experience that on Saturday at a grocery store, and I show up to your church, if it's a different experience than that, I'm going to judge you to what I experienced in my other activities during the week. And if it's a lesser than expected experience, I'm not going to rate you quite as high.
Great point. Does America's shift toward post-church have anything to do with our buildings?
I think it has some impact. I think that the idea of the post-church, what some call postmodern, post-Christian, I actually think is more pre-Christian. I think we've kind of hit that bottom of the U, and now we're becoming back up to almost what pre-Christian is. If you read Mark Driscoll's latest book, Resurgence, he talks about that we're kind of post-Christian now, but we're on this upswing towards pre-Christian. I look at and maybe I'm jaded because I live in the South, but when I think of what's going on in the churches that I'm doing stuff with, whether they're 300 or 3,000, they're having incredible impact and growth. Now, they are doing things in a more unusual way than what we did in 1961 when I was born. We're no longer using the 4 columns and the steeple as an attractional piece to try to draw people in. If anything, it's a rejectional piece. If I think about that 45-year-old guy that's driving down the road, maybe he hasn't been in church since he was a kid, he's got 3 kids in the back seat, and he's thinking to himself, I really need to try to get my kids involved in spirituality in some way. And that's one of the other big trends we're seeing now is I'm a spiritual person, but I'm not a Christian person.
Exactly, yes.
And so there's a hunger still for something that we know is outside of ourselves. And so I'm driving down the road thinking I got to do something for my kids spiritually. And I see your church building. I'm going 45 miles an hour. Is there something about your building that's going to suck me in and draw me in? Or is it going to be something that's going to say, oh, that reminds me of when I was 10 years old and I don't want anything to do with that, and it becomes a repellent to me wanting to then take my kids there. So I think as we become post-Christian, post-church, pre-Christian going into it, the buildings cannot be the deterrent to keep people from coming in. So if a building is welcoming, if you've got umbrella tables out front, you got a playground out front. I look at churches now that have the laundromats in their building. A church in Florida that I just found out about has a post office. And so you're doing life 7 days a week with people. It's kind of what I refer to as well digging instead of temple building. We can't afford to build temples over and over and over again that are used 1 day a week and become that negative influence of the past. If you ever watch Law and Order or SVU or any of those kind of shows, anytime they have a church scene, what kind of church is it? It's always a Catholic or an Episcopal church. And so our culture thinks church in those terms. So we've got to, and that is a repelling kind of feeling to many people that are in their 20s and 30s. That's a good point. So how do we make it feel more welcoming? At the same time, I'm not a proponent of what happened in the 1980s in the church growth movement with the seeker-sensitive stuff. Yeah. The churches that I see growing the fastest, when I look at Elevation or Redeemer up in New York City, or I look at Mars Hill or in Life Church, those are churches that have 2 very common themes. One is they're very traditional in their Bible belief. A sin's a sin. They preach the Word of God. Even at my church, as contemporary as it is, when the pastor reads the scripture, we stand up for it. And yet, we do it in a contextual way. Getting back to that whole thought of contextualization. We're doing it in a way that's contextual to the people that we're trying to reach, but we're not watering down the gospel. The gospel can never change, but our means and methods have to change.
That's right.
I was a music major, unfortunately, in college. And so when people talk to me about, well, let's go back to traditional church. Well, if we really want to go back to traditional church, we should be singing Gregorian chant and wearing robes.
Exactly.
And so, culture's changed. We have to keep up with that from a cultural standpoint, but never water down the gospel.
Facility managers are the unsung heroes, I would say, of many churches, especially mega churches around. And I'd like for you to talk to us about, first of all, how can pastors, how can church leaders communicate more effectively with their facility manager? How can that relationship be better so that the facility really resonates the belief and the why the church exists to the rest of the community?
First off, is most facility managers are seen as the redheaded stepchild of the staff.
Totally.
They're in the basement, they're in the old garage out back, that's their offices, they're not part of the regular office staff. Right. First off, is the pastor has to see them as an important role in the church and not just a janitor. There's also a big difference between a facility maintenance person and a facility manager. A facility maintenance guy is a guy that's fixing light bulbs and wears a tool belt and mops up the floors. A facility manager is as critical as your executive pastor, as your business administrator, as your children's pastor, because they're stewarding what's here. If you look at 1 Kings 6, I think it is, and it talks about how the Levites were the first facility managers ever. It wasn't the other 11 tribes. It was the priests that became the keeper of the facilities. They were truly priests over the whole thing. When you look at the total cost of ownership of a building, we did a article for Church Executive Magazine looking at the total cost of ownership of a 40-year-old building.
Cool.
The initial sticks and bricks was only 20% of the total cost. We figured about $4 million on a simple building. Sure. We figured that you would borrow about $3 million of the $4 million, and you'd pay it off in 7 years at 6% interest, so about $1.1 million in interest.
Right.
The average cost of facilities operations for janitorial, utilities, general maintenance, and capital reserves, the average cost is between $6 and $8 a square foot per year for just those categories.
Wow.
So if you've got 30,000 square feet, you're going to spend somewhere between $150,000 and $240,000 a year just in operational costs. So if you take 40 years, you go with 1% non-compounding inflation per year. Yeah. You end up with almost $16 million in operational costs to maintain your $4 million building. So when you look at the total cost of ownership, between 70 and 80% is in the cost of maintaining the building. That only 20% was to actually get it built. And so when pastors and boards and elders can grasp that, it helps you with your initial planning first. When I think of how am I going to get to a 40-foot chandelier, I need to think about that before I put it in there because that's a long-term operational cost. No doubt. If I don't put in good HVAC and lighting, you're going to pay for that perpetually, and that's going to be at inflated dollars because I've never seen a utility company lower their rates. And so if we don't think in those terms, it also becomes a little bit of that Fram oil filter. And I know you're too young to remember the ads, but the old ads were pay me now or pay me later. And if you pay me later, it's going to be more expensive. You can buy that $8 oil filter now with a $3,000 engine later on. Prime example had a church in Hilton Head that had not recaulked and repainted their windows. And after 10 years, they weren't working real well. And so we did a regression analysis and found that if they just spent about $360 a year doing that, they could have saved their windows. Wow. So they would have spent $3,600 or so over a period of 10 years. Instead, they spent $25,000 to replace them. And so we talk about stewardship, what I call facility stewardship. Is it really smart to not spend $365 a year to in 10 years have to spend $25,000? To me, that's poor stewardship.
Great point. We bring sacredness out now into the topic of conversation, and I know your big bent is in churches need to be more than just a building. They've got to be a community in some sort of way, because otherwise the unchurched driving past are just going to keep driving past every single Sunday. The counter is, how do we bring sacredness though back into church? You know, that what sort of intentionality do pastors need to have for the sacredness?
I think the sacredness has to come from how you use your facility. The facility itself should not drive sacredness. It's what you do in it. If the sacraments are an important part of your tradition and contextualization, then how you do your sacraments, how do you feature certain things? And technology can help with that. You can take a black box and with video projection create stained glass walls all around your building. You can do certain things to change your environments with technology, and so you can go to a fairly austere building and have it feel very sacred. At the same time, I've gone to some very sacred feeling buildings that the worship was anything but sacred. And so again, it's how do we use the facility to facilitate sacredness?
What do you think comes first? Wonderful community because of a great building, or wonderful community because of intentional people?
One of the key factors in a great experience for a guest, and they're guests, not visitors, by the way. A visitor is somebody you want to leave. A guest is somebody you want to feel at home and stay.
Love that.
When we have guests, wayfinding and pretty aesthetics, all that stuff help add to the environment. But the interaction with the people that they're going to meet, from the parking lot team to the greeters to the nursery workers and so on, that is really the key of this. Because I've been in situations where the buildings were lacking, even a high school gym, but the interactions were killer. And it drew me in. I've been in some buildings that were killer, and the interaction just was terrible. And so I think it's the people first. It's that community that then you use a tool to facilitate what you want to do. A new building will not make your people give more. A new building will not help them worship more, will not help them witness more, and it won't help them interact more. So if you don't have that as part of your DNA and culture, the building's not going to help you. All you're going to have is a mortgage payment.
Last question. What's your encouragement to pastors as they think about the future of their church, the future of the global church?
We need to be intentional with everything that we do with our facilities and how we utilize them as a tool. But intentionality doesn't mean more expensive. So to make our buildings more intentional does not mean that we have to raise millions and millions of dollars to do something. Sometimes it's as simple as eliminating too much furniture in a foyer that makes it feel crowded. Sometimes it's putting in a better kids kiosk for check-in, or changing some lighting here or there. We can do a lot of things to be intentional to reach our target market without spending a lot of money. So my encouragement is, don't think you have to spend money, but be intentional about who you are, why you do what you do, then what's the right tool to facilitate that.
Wow. Tim Cool, awesome thoughts. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.